What is it like practicing in the field of child abduction?
Well, as you'll know, Katie, that much like all of family law, but particularly in the case of child abduction, there's a real tension between the fact that you're running often quite complicated legalistic arguments in the High Court, often with very senior specialist barristers on the one hand, and then on the other hand, what you're talking about in practice is a real child, so to speak, who often isn't seen, may be heard from through a Kafkas officer, and often the parties, at least one of them is living abroad, but sometimes both of them don't come to court. So in many cases it's very easy to forget that actually what you're arguing about is a child, and that's the person that's most important in the whole process. On the other hand, it's important not to forget that. In some cases that's far more keenly felt than others. I had a case, for example, where my client hadn't indicated she was coming to court, but in fact turned up to court with the child. The father, who lived abroad, hadn't indicated he was coming to court, but in fact turned up at court, and for reasons I won't go into, the judge ordered there and then that the child, who was 1 year old, be handed over to the father at court. And you can imagine, as a lawyer, dealing with the emotional difficulties that posed for my client, at the same time as trying to argue's perhaps the wrong word, but persuade a High Court judge that this was the wrong decision to be taken, or indeed address the wider issues in the case. And that sort of tension, whilst extreme in that particular example, is exactly what you face in international child abduction, because we all find the arguments very interesting, and that's why we do it. But often the clients just want to have their child back in the country that they think they should live in.
Are there any other anecdotes from your cases that you can provide us with an insight with?
I think recently I've really noticed an increase in the court's steps taken to try and not only locate children but enforce orders to return. And I've had a few recent cases, albeit prior to the pandemic lockdown, in which the judges have ordered grandparents in each of those cases to attend court physically and to answer questions about where their child is, who is themselves shielding the small child in question. And in one of those cases, the judge indicated that if the grandmother didn't give the information that he was looking for, that she would spend the lunchtime adjournment in the cells. I'm sure that's an experience that might ring with you as well. These things are not uncommon, but they're perhaps unique to international child abduction. And indeed the experience that I have with committing parents to prison who don't comply with orders to return a child is something that is relatively rare in the fields of financial remedy or private law children, but in international child abduction happens surprisingly commonly. And indeed I've got a case that's long running that the father's been sent to prison now 3 or 4 times in a row, and every time it looks like he'll be released, we have another hearing to determine whether or not he's going to provide the information necessary to locate his children and return them. And these things, whilst they might seem shocking to an outsider, are relatively common in our field, where we're talking about not just returning a child, but actually working out the mechanics of locating a child and enforcing the return order when it's made. And that's where I'm sure you'll agree that child abduction is never simple. You get a case on your doorstep that you think is going to be easy and looks to your mind as if it's not going to present any difficulties obtaining an order to return a child, or indeed objecting to an order to return a child. But you never quite know what's going to happen until everyone's got involved and all the evidence is on your doorstep, and then suddenly you find that this case is something that you never predicted it could ever become. That's why it's such an interesting area of law.